I talk an awful lot about the fact that I genuinely believe that recovery from an eating disorder is 100% possible for everybody. But that is not to say that it is easy. That's not to say that you don't have to put in the work. And it's certainly not to say that it is a passive process. Entirely the opposite. ED recovery is such an active process. And so I wanted to talk through today what I think of as sort of some of the key ingredients to a successful recovery. So these are the things that you have to do and you have to be willing to do in order to reach that place of full freedom, because it doesn't happen just by luck. So this list that I've compiled is definitely not exhaustive, but it's come about through my own lived experience of going through recovery and going through many recovery attempts that were unsuccessful, and then finally figuring out what seemed to be the right formula to get me to a place of full recovery. And this is also what I use with clients. So I have seen these things work. I can recognize these ingredients in the clients that I work with who make huge progress. So no, it's not a scientific study, but it is based on a lot of observation of both myself and working with clients. So I want to start with empowerment. I have talked about this before, and that is why it is the top of my list. And it is why I do what I do, because it was through coaching that I was able to feel a sense of empowerment. Rather than a lot of other treatment that I had had where I was placed in a very passive role, I found that working with a coach really enabled me to tap into my autonomy, to tap into my agency, and to really take ownership of my own recovery. Because it was in that taking ownership that I was able to take responsibility, that I was able to acknowledge that I wasn't doing everything that I could to recover. And that wasn't someone else's fault. It wasn't because I was broken. It was actually because I was choosing to not take the uncomfortable path. Because that's what recovery is. It is choosing the uncomfortable path time and time again until it doesn't feel uncomfortable anymore. I spent years trying to find a way around that, to recover without doing the uncomfortable things. And surprise, surprise, it didn't work. And it wasn't until I found this level of empowerment where I took control of my own recovery that I was able to take that responsibility, accept my agency here, accept that I wasn't a puppet on a string. So every time that I said I can't do something, I changed my language. No, I won't do that. Right now, I am not feeling willing to do that hard thing in order to recover. And that really brought back to me that I had a choice in how I wanted to live my life. And that it was up to me, that no one was coming to save me, and that I had the power in that moment to choose a different path, to choose to build a different life. Another thing that is absolutely crucial is commitment. Now, I don't mean here motivation. I don't mean intention. I mean commitment. It is a willingness to follow through on your commitments, even when you don't feel like it, even when you don't feel ready. In fact, often before you feel ready. A commitment is a very different thing to acting when you have motivation. It is a much stronger intention. It is something that you have committed to do, that you will do, regardless of maybe your physical state or your emotional state or your mental state in that particular moment. Because if I had relied on wanting to do things, there is absolutely no way that I would be sitting here fully recovered and doing the work that I do today. It was because I committed to doing those actions, in spite of how I felt about it in the moment, because I had an eating disorder. There was no world where my eating disorder was going to be on board with my recovery actions. So it was making that commitment and taking those actions, regardless of how I felt in the moment, that got me to where I am today. Having an abundance of food is also a very important piece of the puzzle when it comes to eating disorder recovery. During an eating disorder, your brain is interpreting that you are in a famine, that food is scarce. So in order to reassure your body and to reassure your brain that food is not scarce, it's really important to have ample, abundant food available, and more importantly, to be eating it. It's about creating an environment where your body can trust that food is no longer scarce, that it is abundant, that it is available whenever your body asks for it, whether that is a physical hunger cue or whether that is a mental hunger cue, and that you are going to respond, that your body can trust you, and that it is in a place of safety. Having food abundantly available and at every opportunity is critical to rewire that scarcity mindset. One that I talk about a lot, and a lot of recovery coaches talk about as well, is the importance of opposite actions. This is about identifying where your eating disorder behaviors or thoughts are showing up and then going in the opposite direction, ideally as far as you can. The best way I have seen to rewire these eating disorder thoughts and behaviors is to take the boldest opposite action you possibly can. Of course, taking any opposite action is to be applauded, but if you want to see yourself take huge strides in your recovery, I really encourage you to seek out the boldest option, to go with the option that your eating disorder most disapproves of. And this is where you can start to get like a bit of a detective. It is about really identifying the sneaky ways perhaps that restriction is showing up, or the way that it's getting involved in your preferences. It's really about completely rooting out that eating disorder, identifying those behaviors, and always then taking the opposite actions. Because by doing this over and over again, your brain will learn that whatever behaviors or whatever thoughts it was generating simply aren't important anymore. And that is how we dismantle that eating disorder neural network. And we replace it with a much healthier neural network that has nothing to do with your eating disorder. One of the hardest things to cultivate is the self-honesty and the self-awareness that is required in eating disorder recovery. No one on the outside can tell you exactly where your eating disorder is showing up. That is something that only you can know. And it is about getting really brutally self-honest as to where it's showing up. What is it getting involved in? Is it getting involved in your resistance to rest? Is it getting involved in your resistance to not put certain activities on a shelf for now? Is it getting involved in your resistance to trying something new? And I think importantly here, it's about recognizing that without that self-honesty, it is unlikely that you are going to be able to get rid of the eating disorder completely. Because as I say, no one outside of you can know exactly where it is hiding. And it might be very uncomfortable to face the truth of exactly where the eating disorder is showing up in your life. It may well involve doing things that your core self doesn't want to do, but you also recognize that the eating disorder really doesn't want you to do that thing, and that it is worthwhile for now to be really honest and to completely dismantle that eating disorder neural network. And I think without this real self-honesty, there can be a tendency to feel like you're maybe getting away with something. But I'd encourage you to view that as you are only shortchanging yourself. You aren't getting away with anything. No one gets away with a half life. No one gets away with quasi-recovery. I have been there. I have seen clients there. It is not getting away with a fun existence. It is shortchanging yourself. It is shortchanging your recovery. And it is shortchanging the life that you ultimately want to be living. So I really encourage you to get honest with yourself, to have that self-awareness, to do self-reflection activities, to really think about and acknowledge where your eating disorder is showing up. And then have that commitment and take the opposite actions to get rid of it. And in doing all of these opposite actions, in making those commitments, one of the biggest things, a big key to recovery is having a willingness to sit with the discomfort. It is quite likely, if you've got an eating disorder, that going against its suggestions, that going against its behaviors is going to feel very uncomfortable. Taking a different neural network is going to cause distress. There will be distress around what you have eaten, how much you have rested, your body that might be changing. There is all sorts of different ways that distress could be triggered. So it's important to acknowledge that this is part of the recovery journey, that this is not a sign to stop, that this is a sign to learn how to cope with these distressing emotions, this discomfort, and that you need to keep taking those opposite actions until such a time that those things no longer cause these negative emotions. And part of this willingness to cope and sit with discomfort is a willingness to experiment and to try different coping strategies that are much healthier, that are much less maladaptive, that you can use now and that you can take through to other distressing experiences in your life. It is again about building those muscles and building those tools of self-support and self-regulation, and to be able to sit with yourself through distressing times. Because this is one of those very predictable parts of recovery. We know that there will be discomfort. We know that there will be distress. And it is about having a willingness to sit through it, to use other healthy coping mechanisms, and to build that muscle. Another thing that I have talked about before, and I find it incredibly important to the recovery process, is really understanding your why. Why is it that you want to recover? What is it about having an eating disorder that is so destructive to your life? That's probably the easy one. But also, what is the life that you want for yourself? What does that look like? What does that, more importantly, feel like? Ground yourself in those values, in that vision. Come back to that. Zoom out when you have moments of doubt that this is the direction in which you are traveling for all of these reasons. It is so valuable to have something as tangible as that to always come back to. Because this is not a linear process. It is said very often, and it is true. There will be changes in your motivation. There will be changes in your willingness to do the work. But one of the most helpful things is to have a really clear why, a really clear reason that you can come back to know exactly why you'd be willing to put up with this short-term discomfort for that long-term future. Finding the right type of support for you and for where you are in your recovery is another really important part of this process. Of course, you are the only one who can take those recovery actions, but you don't have to do it alone. You don't have to do it without support. So I would really encourage you to experiment with different types of support, and that could look like different medical professionals, it could look like coaching, it could look like an accountability buddy, it could look like friends, family, siblings, partners. Again, get honest with yourself as to where you need most support. What are the hurdles that maybe you've experienced before? How can you get ahead of your eating disorder? There are just so many different options here. So as I say, I really encourage you to experiment and to get honest with yourself as to how you could maybe help yourself on this journey. Set yourself up for success, because it's very often the eating disorder that wants to push away support. There are lots of different ways that you can feel supported in this journey. So as I say, I really encourage you to consider what is best for you at every point in your journey. And finally, what I see making a big difference in recovery journeys is the ability to prioritize recovery as much as possible. Like always, we come back to honesty. This takes real honesty to say, what can I put down for now? How can I best prioritize my recovery? How can I make it number one on my list every single day? Of course, there are life commitments that possibly can't be put down. But it is about getting honest as to, well, what can you delegate? What can you do in your day-to-day that will make it easier for you to prioritize recovery? Because prioritizing recovery now means prioritizing life later. When you are fully recovered, you will be able to show up for life. You will be able to show up for the people in your life in a much more authentic, genuine, joyful way than you ever could with an eating disorder and even while going through recovery. It is an intense process. So I really, really strongly advocate for wherever you can, however it is possible, that you prioritize yourself and your recovery. This may well look different throughout your recovery, but always I believe it to be of utmost importance that you prioritize your recovery wherever you can. So that's just my hot take. These are the things that I have noticed making the biggest difference, and these are the things that really make recovery possible. So I hope that you have maybe been able to reflect there and see maybe what you might be missing if you are struggling in your recovery journey, and to really get practical about what recovery entails and how you can set yourself up to win. So take care for now, and I look forward to speaking again soon.